In October 1973, Americans lined up at gas stations for miles, their cars forming snaking queues that seemed to have no end. Tempers flared as pumps ran dry. Stations hung "Sorry, no gas" signs in their windows. The scenes would have been unthinkable just months earlier in a nation accustomed to cheap, abundant energy. The world's most powerful economy had been brought to its knees not by military force, but by an embargo, a simple refusal to sell. For the first time, oil had been successfully deployed as a geopolitical weapon. The oil embargo of 1973 didn't just create temporary inconvenience. It shattered America's post-war economic certainties, transformed global power structures, and revealed dangerous dependencies that few had fully appreciated. This was the moment when the modern energy economy, with all its vulnerabilities and contradictions, was truly born. The story of the 1973 oil crisis is a tale of power, miscalculation, and unintended consequences that continues to shape our world half a century later. The road to crisis. To understand what happened in 1973, we must step back to the years following World War II. The United States had emerged from the global conflict as the world's dominant economic and military power. American oil companies, the Seven Sisters as they were known, controlled much of the world's petroleum resources, particularly in the Middle East. Companies like Exxon, Mobil, and Texaco dictated terms to oil-producing nations, determining production levels and prices that suited Western interests. By the early 1950s, however, the dynamics began to shift. In 1951, Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, challenging Western control over Iranian resources. The response was swift. Britain imposed a crushing economic blockade, and in 1953, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup that removed Mossadegh from power. The message seemed clear. Oil-producing nations had limited sovereignty over their own resources, but the seeds of resistance had been planted. In September 1960, representatives from 5 oil-producing countries, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, met in Baghdad and formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Their initial goal was modest: to coordinate petroleum policies and secure fair prices for their oil. Few Western observers took OPEC seriously at first. As Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, Saudi Arabia's oil minister from 1962 to 1986, later reflected, the formation of OPEC was not seen as a threat by the West. They laughed at us, but we knew that eventually the control of oil would return to its rightful owners. The 1960s saw gradual changes in the global oil market. The United States, once the world's largest oil exporter, became increasingly dependent on foreign oil as domestic consumption soared. In 1970, U.S. oil production peaked and began its long decline, precisely as American appetite for petroleum products was accelerating. By 1973, the United States was importing 36% of its oil needs. The vulnerability this created would soon be exposed. The spark, the Yom Kippur War. On October 6, 1973, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, seeking to reclaim territories lost in the 1967 Six-Day War. The conflict caught Israel off guard, and initially, Egyptian and Syrian forces made significant advances. Israel's Prime Minister Golda Meir urgently appealed to the United States for military aid. After brief hesitation, President Richard Nixon authorized Operation Nickel Grass, a massive airlift of military supplies to Israel. The U.S. delivered over 22,000 tons of tanks, artillery, ammunition, and supplies. This American intervention proved decisive, helping Israel turn the tide of the war. The Arab response was swift. On October 16, 1973, OPEC's Arab members led by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Libya, and Algeria announced they would reduce oil production by 5% immediately, with additional 5% reductions each month until Israel withdrew from territories occupied in 1967. More dramatically, Saudi Arabia and other Arab oil producers announced a complete embargo on oil shipments to the United States and other countries that had supported Israel, including the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. The price of oil immediately jumped from approximately $3 per barrel to nearly $12. Henry Kissinger, then U.S. Secretary of State, later wrote, "The oil weapon was unleashed as an unmistakable act of economic warfare. The industrialized world was about to learn just how dependent it had become on cheap, reliable access to Middle Eastern oil." America in crisis. The effects in the United States were immediate and severe. President Nixon addressed the nation on November 7, 1973, "We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II." He announced a series of emergency measures, including lowering speed limits nationwide to 55 km/h, dimming Christmas lights, and asking gas stations to close on Sundays. In December, Nixon appointed William Simon as the nation's first energy czar, heading the newly created Federal Energy Office with sweeping powers to allocate petroleum supplies and control prices. The American public faced a shocking new reality. Gas stations implemented odd-even rationing systems based on license plate numbers. Drivers could only purchase gasoline on odd or even days, depending on their plate. Lines at service stations sometimes stretched for miles, with motorists waiting hours only to be limited to 10 gallons or less. Economist Alan Blinder described the scene. It was surreal. The most powerful nation on Earth was being held hostage by countries many Americans couldn't locate on a map. The psychological impact was even greater than the economic one. As winter approached, the crisis deepened. Schools and offices closed to conserve heat. Factories shut down, laying off thousands of workers. By early 1974, unemployment was rising sharply. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 45% between January 1973 and December 1974, one of the most severe bear markets since the Great Depression. President Nixon's economic advisor, Herbert Stein, captured the national mood. "We have lived so long in a world of continuous growth and endless promises that the possibility of physical limitations to our way of life is almost incomprehensible." The crisis forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their energy consumption. The United States, with just 6% of the world's population, was consuming over 30% of the world's energy. The days of cheap, unlimited oil, a foundation of post-war American prosperity, appeared to be over.
Do you like to dig deeper? Political economy is full of powerful ideas. You're right in the thick of it. Insightful, thought-provoking, expanding every step of the way. From Adam Smith and the rise of capitalism to Marx's bold critique, mercantilism, Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, and more. We explore it all, clearly and from every angle. Keep the momentum going. Check the links, dive deeper, and subscribe for more.
Global shockwaves. Though the embargo specifically targeted the United States and a few other nations, its effects reverberated globally. The reduction in overall oil production affected all importing nations, and OPEC's dramatic price increases applied worldwide. Western Europe, even more dependent on Middle Eastern oil than the United States, was thrown into crisis. The Netherlands, specifically targeted by the embargo due to its pro-Israel stance, implemented car-free Sundays, when private automobile use was banned entirely. Citizens took to empty highways on bicycles and horseback, creating surreal scenes in one of Europe's most developed economies. Japan, with virtually no domestic oil production, was particularly vulnerable. Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka broke with U.S. Middle East policy, issuing statements sympathetic to the Arab position in an attempt to secure oil supplies. The Japanese economy, which had enjoyed remarkable growth since World War II, suffered its first year of negative growth since Reconstruction. In Britain, already struggling with economic problems, the oil crisis compounded existing difficulties. The Conservative government of Edward Heath imposed a 3-day workweek to conserve electricity, with commercial users of electricity limited to 3 specified consecutive days each week. Television stations were required to end broadcasting at 10:30 p.m. to save energy. French President Georges Pompidou observed grimly, "The world is changing before our eyes. The era of cheap energy is over. For developing nations without oil reserves, the consequences were catastrophic. Unable to afford quadrupled oil prices, many faced severe economic contraction. The crisis accelerated the already significant debt problems that would plague the developing world throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Meanwhile, oil-producing nations experienced unprecedented windfalls. Saudi Arabia's oil revenues jumped from $4.3 billion in 1973 to $22.6 billion in 1974. The world witnessed a massive transfer of wealth from oil-consuming to oil-producing nations, what economist Ibrahim Owais termed petrodollars. As Saudi oil minister Sheikh Yamani declared, "The moment has arrived when the oil-producing countries are going to set the price of their oil. We are masters of our own commodity." Economic transformation. The immediate price shock of the oil embargo triggered a profound economic crisis in the West. For the first time, the world experienced stagflation, the previously unthinkable combination of high inflation, economic stagnation, and rising unemployment. Traditional Keynesian economic policy had no ready answers for this new phenomenon. In the United States, inflation reached 12% in 1974, while unemployment approached 9%. The economy contracted by 3.2%, creating the most severe recession since the 1930s. Economic historian Charles Kindleberger noted, "The oil crisis marked the end of the long post-war boom. The golden age of capitalism was over. Central banks faced an impossible dilemma: raise interest rates to fight inflation but risk deepening unemployment, or stimulate the economy and watch inflation spiral further out of control." The crisis fundamentally challenged prevailing economic orthodoxy and set the stage for the monetary policies of the late 1970s and early 1980s. The crisis accelerated structural changes in Western economies. Energy-intensive industries like steel, automobile manufacturing, and chemicals faced severe challenges. Companies that couldn't adapt to higher energy costs went bankrupt or were forced to dramatically restructure. Economist Jeffrey Sachs observed, "The oil shock wasn't just a temporary disruption. It fundamentally altered the structure of the global economy. Power shifted eastward and southward toward the energy producers, while the old industrial centers of the West began a painful process of adaptation and, in many cases, decline. The petrodollar recycling challenge became a major concern. Oil-producing nations accumulated vast financial reserves that needed to be invested somewhere. Much of this money flowed into Western banks, which then lent eagerly to developing nations, creating the debt bomb that would explode in the Latin American debt crisis of the early 1980s. Political fallout. The oil crisis profoundly reshaped global politics. In the United States, it contributed to the erosion of public confidence in government that had begun with the Vietnam War and accelerated with the Watergate scandal. President Nixon's approval ratings, already low, plummeted further. The crisis also transformed American Middle East policy. Henry Kissinger embarked on shuttle diplomacy, traveling repeatedly between Middle Eastern capitals in an attempt to broker peace and end the embargo. The United States began to view stable access to Middle Eastern oil as a vital national security interest, a perspective that would guide American foreign policy for decades to come. For the Soviet Union, the crisis initially appeared to be a strategic windfall. The Western alliance showed signs of fracture as European nations and Japan distanced themselves from American Middle East policy. Moreover, as a major oil producer itself, the USSR benefited from higher global oil prices. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev reportedly told his Politburo. The capitalists have finally encountered a crisis they cannot easily overcome. Their unity is breaking down. However, the long-term consequences were more complex. Western nations accelerated efforts to reduce dependency on Middle Eastern oil, developing new fields in Alaska, the North Sea, and elsewhere. The crisis also spurred research into alternative energy sources and conservation measures, reducing long-term demand. Within the Middle East, the crisis transformed political dynamics. Oil-producing states gained unprecedented wealth and influence. Saudi Arabia emerged as both a critical economic power and a key American strategic ally, a relationship that continues to shape regional politics today. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who had reluctantly supported the embargo, understood the dual-edged nature of the oil weapon. In one way, the use of oil as a weapon in 1973 was a great success, but it was also dangerous. We cannot push the West too far. The end of the embargo. By early 1974, it was becoming clear that the embargo had reached the limits of its effectiveness. While it had caused severe economic pain in target countries, it had not achieved its stated political goal of forcing Israel to withdraw from occupied territories. Diplomatic efforts led by Kissinger gradually bore fruit. In January 1974, Israel and Egypt signed a disengagement agreement for the Sinai Peninsula. Though far from a comprehensive peace, it provided the Arab oil ministers with sufficient political cover to reconsider the embargo. On March 18, 1974, all but Libya and Syria agreed to end the embargo against the United States. OPEC announced it would increase production, though oil prices remained at their new, much higher levels. As the immediate crisis eased, President Nixon sought to project confidence. In a televised address, he declared, "We have weathered the storm. The embargo is over, and America has learned valuable lessons about our energy needs." Behind closed doors, however, the administration recognized that fundamental realities had changed. A classified National Security Council memorandum stated, "The era of cheap energy is finished. The United States must adapt to a world where access to oil is more expensive and less certain." The 1973 oil crisis fundamentally altered the global energy landscape. In its immediate aftermath, Western nations implemented a range of measures to reduce oil dependency. The United States established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975, created the Department of Energy in 1977, and imposed the first fuel economy standards for automobiles. Japan and Europe, with fewer domestic energy resources, moved even more aggressively toward conservation and efficiency. Japan's remarkable advances in energy-efficient manufacturing date largely from this period. France launched the world's most ambitious nuclear power program, which today provides nearly 75% of its electricity. The crisis spurred interest in alternative energy sources. Solar and wind power research received significant funding for the first time. As President Jimmy Carter said while unveiling solar panels on the White House roof in 1979, "Yes, one can embargo sunlight." Yet the most significant response was market-driven. Higher prices stimulated exploration and production in regions previously considered uneconomical. The development of Alaska's North Slope, Mexico's Cantarell Field, and Britain's North Sea oil resources were direct responses to the new price environment. The geopolitical consequences proved equally profound. The crisis demonstrated that control over oil resources provided substantial international leverage. For the first time, relatively small nations could directly impact global superpowers, a reality that transformed diplomatic calculations. The United States deepened its involvement in the Middle East, establishing security relationships with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states that continue today. American military planners began viewing Persian Gulf oil as a vital interest worth defending by force if necessary, a doctrine that would eventually lead to direct military interventions decades later. For oil-producing nations, the crisis marked a watershed. Venezuelan oil minister Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, one of OPEC's founders, observed, "We are witnessing a fundamental transfer of wealth from those who consume oil to those who produce it. The world will never be the same." Yet, this newfound power came with responsibilities and risks. The massive influx of oil wealth created economic distortions in many producing countries, what economists would later call the resource curse. Rather than developing diversified economies, many became even more dependent on oil exports. As Saudi oil minister Sheikh Yamani presciently warned in 1975, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, and the oil age will end long before we run out of oil." The 1973 oil crisis revealed the fragility of an industrial civilization built on cheap, abundant energy. In a matter of months, the certainties that had underpinned post-war prosperity were shattered. Nations accustomed to energy security found themselves vulnerable. Consumers accustomed to abundance faced scarcity. The crisis demonstrated how thoroughly oil had become the lifeblood of modern economies and how dangerous dependency could be when suppliers chose to restrict access. It showed that economic power could be as decisive as military might in international relations. In many ways, we still live in the world created by those tumultuous months in late 1973 and early 1974. The Middle East remains a critical focus of global geopolitics. Energy security continues to shape national strategies. The fundamental tension between energy needs and political independence persists. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis forced a recognition that resources are finite, that growth has limits, and that the Earth's bounty cannot be taken for granted. As we navigate the energy transitions of our own time, the lessons of 1973 remain relevant. A reminder that what seems permanent can change with breathtaking speed, and that the foundations of prosperity are more fragile than they appear. The lines at the gas stations eventually disappeared, but the world they revealed, a world of resource competition, economic vulnerability, and shifting power, is still very much with us today.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.